What is up, you guys? Welcome back to the channel and welcome to another gruesome Get Ready With Me video. If this is your first time seeing my face, my name is Jessica, and in each of these videos I sit down here with you guys and we discuss a different true crime case whilst I put on some makeup. So if that sounds fun to you, I'd say subscribe, stick around, and join me back here each week. If the combination isn't for you, I've got some links down in the description, but for those of you who are sticking around, let's go ahead and get into today's case. Girl, when I tell you that no matter how many times I hear today's story, hear it, read it, see it, probably when I'm done speaking it here myself, I will simply never, ever be able to believe that this shit actually happened. The fact that a human can not only endure what the victim in today's story did, but the fact that she survived it, how? This story illustrates, without a doubt, one of the most incredible displays of human strength and determination ever, at least that I personally know of. Today, we're going to be discussing the unbelievable survival story of Alison Botha. This case was kindly requested by two sweet supporters, so Angie from New York and Anika from South Africa. Both were kind enough to request this one, so thank you so much, ladies, for making this video possible. Even though this story has always been fascinating to me, I don't know that I ever would have covered it myself had it not been a request, just because it's definitely a much more widely covered story than a lot of the stories that I choose to present. But there's actually been a fairly recent update to this story that happened back at the end of 2024. So if ever, I suppose, there was a time for me to cover this one, I definitely think that it would be now. So without further ado, this is Alison's story. All right, y'all, pack your bags and grab your passports because we're headed to South Africa today. Specifically, we're headed to a cute little coastal town called Port Elizabeth. Actually, since this story took place, Port Elizabeth has been renamed to, Lord help me with this one, Krueger?
It is so bad, I want to give you a 0, but that's not possible. So I give you a 1.
Yeah, I won't be touching that pronunciation again with a 10-foot pole, so we're going to be sticking with Port Elizabeth today. Resting on just under 97 square miles of land and hosting a population of just shy of 1 million people, Port Elizabeth is located on Algoa Bay in South Africa's Eastern Cape Province. Considering that Port Elizabeth is a port town, duh, obviously it's most well known for its beaches and its close proximity to the Indian Ocean. Beyond that, though, it is also known for its wildlife, its museums, its parks, and its beautiful local art. Truly, some of the photos that I saw of this place, stunning. Unfortunately, though, despite its beauty and its seemingly peaceful appearance, Port Elizabeth sadly does serve as the backdrop for the horrific story that gathers us here today. Allison Jane Collier was born on September 22nd, 1967 in Port Elizabeth, South Africa, to her parents Brian and Claire. Allison was the second born of the couple's 2 children. She was preceded in birth by her older brother Neil, and from what I was able to gather from my research as well as straight from Allison's book, it seems as though she had quite a happy and loving and well-rounded upbringing. Even following her parents' divorce in 77, when she was just 10 years old, Allison has stated that still, even through such a difficult time, she never felt anything other than completely and totally loved and supported by both her parents, but particularly by her mother. Following Claire and Brian's separation, Allison and Neil both primarily lived with Claire, and in Allison's book, she makes special mention of the fact that her mother always, without fail, made a point to pull her children aside and to tell them just how truly special they were. Claire didn't care what her kids wanted to be when they grew up. She didn't have strict goals or paths lined up for them in her head. All she cared about was that they were happy and loved and that they knew just how truly valued they were. She could tell from a very early age with both of her children that they were going to grow up to be just such wonderful people. So she never let a moment go by without letting them know how proud she was of them and how much she loved them. She genuinely sounds like just the best mom. And with such a loving and supportive home life, it's no wonder that Allison grew up to be an incredibly well-adjusted and incredibly well-rounded individual. Not only was she super confident with a very strong sense of self-worth, but she was also friendly and kind. She was smart. She was funny. She excelled both socially and academically, even being named head girl at her high school in 1985 because she showed so much promise and so much potential. Like I said, all in all, Allison appears to have had an incredible upbringing. She had a wonderful support system, and by the time she graduated high school, it looked as though she would be setting out to have just a really happy and successful life. Following graduation, Allison studied at the Port Elizabeth Technicon School for about a year before she then decided to take a break from academics altogether to try her hand in the workforce. She dabbled around at a few different temporary jobs in her hometown before she ultimately decided to take a few years to travel abroad and to work and just to try to take in what the world had to offer. Ultimately, Allison ended up living in London for a couple of years before eventually returning to and settling back down in Port Elizabeth sometime in the early 90s. She got herself an apartment, she got a great job working as an insurance broker, she was close with her family, she had a great group of friends, she loved where she lived, and she enjoyed her job. From the outside looking in, it seemed as though nothing could bring Allison down. She truly was just out there living her absolute best life. No one could have possibly imagined that this beautiful life that Allison had built for herself, well, when she was just 27 years old, it would be completely flipped upside down. And it would all take place at the hands of two just rotten, miserable pieces of shit. And that, my friends, actually brings us to December 17th, 1994, which sadly was the last normal day that Allison would ever live. Now, although it was December, given that South Africa is located in the southern hemisphere, it was actually summer in Port Elizabeth. So while all of us up here were in our coats and our galoshes, Allison and her friends were planning a day trip to the beach. Can you imagine the beach in December? I mean, obviously there's places even in the US where you can experience that. I don't happen to live in one of them. It's fine. I've only been snowed in with my kids for the last few days who are going clinically insane from cabin fever, but it's fine. I'm fine. They're fine. We're all fine. What was I talking about? Oh, right. The beach. Yes, Allison and her friends went to the beach that day. They lounged in the sand. They spent some time in the water. The weather was beautiful. Overall, it was just a perfect summer day. Then, once they were done at the beach, they all made their way back to Allison's apartment where they ordered pizza and they played board games. And they actually all ended up hanging out there until I think it was probably sometime after midnight when everyone started to clear out. Everyone, that is, except for Allison's friend, Kim. You see, Kim hadn't driven herself to the beach that day, but that wasn't a problem. Allison had still wanted her to come back to the apartment with everyone for the night, so she just promised Kim that later on, when everyone left, she would take her home. So, as Allison's other friends cleared out, she and Kim headed out to her little yellow Renault 5. They drove to Kim's, Allison then dropped her off, and she turned around and she headed back to her apartment. I believe she got back sometime right after 1 a.m. So now it's technically December 18th, 1994. Allison has obviously had a very long day. She's been in the sun all day. She's been cutting it up with her friends. Like I said, it's past 1 a.m. at this point. I mean, she was beat. All she wanted to do was go inside, hop in the shower, and then finally crawl into bed. Frustratingly, though, for Allison, when she got back to her apartment building, the parking spot that she typically parked in, it had been taken. Apartment living, am I right? Now, I don't know if this spot was specifically assigned to Allison and someone took it anyway. I don't know if it was just a spot that Allison liked to park in when she got the opportunity because it was close to the building and it was well lit. Whatever the case may be, when Allison got back from dropping Kim off, the spot was no longer available. And actually, none of the close, well-lit spots were open. Allison ended up having to drive around for a few minutes up and down the street that her apartment complex was on before she finally just decided that she was going to have to settle on a much less desirable parking spot. Not only was this spot like 10 meters or so away from her apartment building, but it was also under this like big ass tree, meaning that when she got out of her car, she was going to be in the pitch black shadow that this tree was creating. But like I said, she was tired, she was over it, and she just wanted to get inside. So she parked her car, she turned off the ignition, and she reached over to the passenger seat to grab a couple of things. And that is when she felt it. A very unexpected gust of warm summer air. Someone had just opened Allison's car door, and before she could even really process what was happening, a man's voice told her, "Move or I'll kill you." And when she turned around to see who was making these demands, Allison was actually surprised to see sort of a scrawny looking man, a pretty non-threatening looking man, standing in the doorway of her car. However, just because the man wasn't necessarily all that threatening looking, the knife that he was brandishing, that sure was. So obviously, not wanting to anger this man instinctively, Allison simply did as she was told. She shifted herself over into the passenger seat and she left room for this strange man to take his place behind the wheel. And as this man started the car and took off from in front of Allison's apartment, she suddenly realized that she was paralyzed with fear. Who was this man? What did he want with her? Surely it couldn't be anything good, right? Allison was so scared that for a moment, she actually contemplated just tucking and rolling right about the car. She thought that maybe she could jump out and she could get herself to safety before this man would be able to manage to turn around and get back to her. However, before she could really make a decision, this man started speaking to her. He introduced himself. He told her that his name was Clint, and he assured her that he didn't have any plans to hurt her. He told her that he simply needed to use her car for a few hours and that as long as she cooperated with him, that everything would be fine. And while obviously Allison still didn't feel good about the situation, hearing this man promise her that no harm would befall her, she decided that she would put her plans to cannonball out onto the asphalt on the back burner. Because mind you, homeboy was driving pretty fast at this point. So not only was he telling her that he had no intentions to hurt her, but comparatively speaking, she knew if she jumped out of the car at the rate they were going, that surely was not going to fare well for her. So instead, she just sat there quietly, only speaking if and when this man spoke to her. Eventually, Clint did ask her what her name was, and although she lied and she told him that her name was Susan, she did answer him. She even tried to tell him that she had a boyfriend back at home waiting for her at her apartment, and she asked if he would just let her out and take the car, but unfortunately, Clinton wasn't having any of that. Instead, he told her that he wanted her company while he drove around doing God knows what. But who really was this man? Because just like Allison ain't Susan, homeboy wasn't Clinton. Rather, Clinton was actually a man named Franz Dutoit. And sadly for Allison, Franz Dutoit was not the kind of person that you ever wanted to find yourself alone and captive with. Franz Dutoit was born on July 6th, 1968 in Malitswai, South Africa, formerly known as Alawal North. As far as I'm aware, he was the only child born to his very conservative Christian parents. And sadly, despite his parents' best efforts to raise their son with their same holy, God-fearing values, they failed. Spoiler alert. By the time Franz was just 13, he had fully transformed from a devoted youth group member, son of a policeman, to a mischievous little thug. He started doing drugs, he caused never-ending trouble at his school, and he was actually starting to get in trouble with the law at this point. Like I said, just a real degenerate piece of shit. The problem, though, was that no matter what Franz did, his parents simply could not see anything past their sweet little boy. And so this meant that every time Franz found himself in trouble, before he even had a chance to feel the wrath of the consequences of his actions, along would come his parents to bail him right out. For whatever reason, these two wholeheartedly believed that Franz could not possibly be to blame for his own behavior. Rather, they believed that he was simply at the mercy of the crowd of ruffians that he had chosen to surround himself with as he made his way into his teen years. And because Fran's father was, as previously mentioned, a police officer, each and every time his precious little boy found himself on the wrong side of the rules or even the wrong side of the actual law, along came Daddy, badge in hand, ready to bail this shitbag right back out of trouble. Even when Franz lit his literal school on fire, his parents still attributed this and all of his previous wrongdoings right back to the fact that he just happened to fall in with the wrong crowd. You know, he wasn't bad. He was just a victim of his circumstances. Franz, on the other hand, I guess desperate to keep his friends, he instead tried to blame his shitty behavior on the fact that he listened to heavy metal music. Give me a fucking break. We've heard this countless times before, right? This is nothing new. Of course, they tried to blame Columbine on Marilyn Manson, which was also stupid, because literally millions of people listen to these alternative genres of music, myself included. And I think it's safe to say that the overwhelming majority do not go on to commit these kinds of heinous atrocities. So even if, statistically speaking, people who do commit crimes like this tend to listen to those types of music more than other genres, correlation most certainly does not imply causation. Rather, I think that it is much more likely and much more realistic that Fran's terrible behavior began to escalate the way that it did because his parents never allowed him to be held accountable for his actions. He never experienced any real-world consequences during his formative years. He was all but conditioned to believe that he could get away with whatever he wanted to. So why would he feel like there was any reason to turn his life around? Like I said, even when he tried to burn down his school, rather than allowing him to experience whatever might have been coming down the pipeline at him, his parents instead whisked him away from Allowal North, 300 miles south to Port Elizabeth, in hopes that a new city and a new school might provide him with a fresh start. It sure didn't though. I know, right? Shocking. Turns out, it didn't matter where he was. New city, old city, red city, blue city. Franz was he was too far gone. He had no intentions of trying to turn his life around. If anything, it was actually after this big move to Port Elizabeth that Franz really started to cut ties with his family's religion and their values. Like, I'm talking he went from one end of the spectrum all the way to the other end. From God and Jesus straight down to, El Diablo.
The devil.
Now, to Fran's credit, which, yes, is a sentence that burns my tongue to say, but his descent into Satanism actually wasn't like a solo mission. From what we do know about him, it seems like he only began to dabble in these darker type of things after he had met and began dating a girl who claimed to him that she was a witch. And she wasn't just any witch. No. She was the head witch, apparently, of her coven. She told Franz that she had all sorts of dark powers, and that in turn, if she wanted to, she could totally use said powers to either curse people, or to summon demons, or even just to outright possess people. And I guess, hearing this, Franz was like, hot. And then over the course of their relationship, Franz, too, became enthralled with Satan and dark magic, and he began trying to learn anything and everything that he possibly could from this girl. He's even gone on to claim that he experienced his own demonic possessions on numerous occasions throughout this time frame. Mind you, he's still in his early teens at this point, as in like 14, maybe 15. So while he should have been at school studying math and literature, Franz was instead skipping school and letting his grades plummet so that he could instead study witchcraft and Satanism. And this caused his academics to fall so far to the wayside that within just a couple years of moving to Port Elizabeth, Franz ended up dropping out of school altogether. And again, rather than seeing this as a problem with their son, like it was, Fran's parents instead blamed all of this, you guessed it, on his girlfriend. Not a big proponent of accountability or consequences, these people. Not at all. Once Franz turned 18, he did enlist in the military for a short time. However, he couldn't seem to keep himself out of trouble during that time frame either. He was always being reprimanded. He was always being punished. And as we know, this was not something that Franz was used to, let alone very keen on. So by the time he was 20, he went ahead and chose to abandon this potential career path as well. Now, the details on this next part are a little murky, but somehow, some way, from this point, Franz actually went on to get married.
What?
And not only that, he and his wife also went on to have a little baby girl. However, pretty much as soon as the umbilical cord was cut, Franz he dipped out. Yep, he's a deadbeat dad too. So just the total package. Am I right? Honestly though, well, I'm sure it was difficult for his wife in the moment. Later down the line, I have to assume that she was very relieved when she realized just how big of a bullet she'd managed to dodge. Not that that excuses him from being a huge piece of shit, because it certainly doesn't. But that said, once this video is over, I bet we will all be in agreement that this woman and her daughter, they had to have fared much better off without this loser dragging them down. I mean, this man left his wife when she was newly postpartum because she wasn't satisfying him sexually anymore. Yeah, grow the fuck up. This woman just gave birth. Be a man, shut up, and rub one out like every other normal man does after his wife gives birth. Every man other than Franz, though, because he's a very special breed. He instead abandoned his family to go out and to get himself a whole-ass new wife and have a whole-ass other kid. This time, a son. However, don't get me wrong, because I don't think that he cared any more about this child than he cared about his daughter. As far as I can tell, he didn't value his son as anything other than a way to potentially prove to people how magical and powerful he was. And what I mean by that is the whole time that his second wife was pregnant, Franz did spells and incantations and black magic over her pregnant belly daily, all in an effort just to ensure that his son would be born on his birthday. Why? Couldn't tell you, but to hear Franz tell it, shit totally worked. He put the order out into the universe, then July 6th, 1993 rolled around, and supposedly out popped baby Franz. Now, personally, I call bullshit on this, as do a lot of people, because I don't think that it's public knowledge what Franz's son's birthday really is, nor should it be. However, most people still seem to think that he's lying about his son's birthday in order to bolster his claims that he's magical and powerful and can make stuff happen. Again, I stand firmly in the camp that believes that homie's spouting off some hot, steaming bullshit, but of course, you're entitled to believe whatever you truly think happened. Oh, and another claim that Franz has made that I personally find outrageous and almost laughable is that one of his powers is that he was born as a gift to women. Yeah, this guy. A self-proclaimed gift to women. The audacity of him to say that with this haircut.
It's hideous!
Anyway, yes, this is who had abducted Allison at knife point that fateful evening. This Satan-worshipping, high school dropout, military reject, deadbeat father, degenerate thug. This absolute piece of work is who Allison now finds herself at the mercy of. Franz de Troyes. Like I said, not the type of person that one wants to find themselves alone and captive with. And even without knowing all of these details, Allison was still desperate to try to get away from this man. Like when she noticed a yellow police van about 15 meters up the street from her car, she wanted nothing more than to flag them down and to have them whisk her away from this man. But before they got even anywhere close enough for Allison to try to signal to these officers for help, the police van turned down a side road and it disappeared. Her hopes for rescue faded right away with their bright red brake lights as they rounded that corner. And not only was her glimmer of hope now gone, but being in such close proximity to that police van had clearly rattled her abductor. He went from driving calmly and with a level head to speeding round and driving increasingly more erratically. And understandably, Allison was becoming more and more anxious as Clint repeatedly looped these streets surrounding a local nightclub called Club Tonight. He was cursing under his breath and clearly becoming more and more agitated, and as every moment passed, his overall calm demeanor was really starting to slip. And there were so many people out on the street surrounding this club, so many potential witnesses to Allison's abduction, so many possibilities for her to motion for help, but she just couldn't convince herself to do it. At the end of the day, she didn't know these people on the street any more than she knew this man sitting next to her. This club nightlife, it really wasn't her scene. So for all she knew, the person that she decided to alert to her abduction, how did she know that it wasn't going to be someone that this man happened to know? In her brain at that time, these were his people and this was his turf. And just as Allison began to wonder why on earth they were continuously circling this club over and over and over again, her heart dropped as she got her answer. Her captor was now pulling her car over in order to pick up a second man. She was about to officially be outnumbered. Sure, the situation had never been ideal, but up to this point, 1v1, that had seemed manageable to Allison. Clint, Franz, had been mostly calm up to this point, and in turn, this had helped Allison stay mostly calm. He'd done at least a halfway decent job of convincing her that as long as she cooperated with him, ultimately, she would walk away from this. But as this short, stocky young man, dressed in all black, climbed into the back seat of Allison's car, and she got a look at his eyes in her rearview mirror, that was the precise moment that Allison realized just how much trouble she truly might be in. This man, this bonus passenger, he had no life in his eyes. He looked like he had no soul. And even looking into his eyes through the rearview mirror, Allison felt like it was synonymous with looking into the eyes of the actual devil. So who exactly is this man? Thienes Krueger was born sometime in 1975. So he was actually quite a bit younger than both Franz and Allison. Like Allison, Thienes did grow up primarily in Port Elizabeth. However, unlike Allison, Thienes' family was shit. His father walked out on he and his mother before he was even born, which then led his mother to parade a revolving door of different men through his life, none of which sound exemplary. Basically, he didn't even have a fraction of love or support or stability growing up. And to add insult to injury, he was also mercilessly bullied when he was at school as well. Yeah, evidently, Thienes had a bit of a third nipple situation. And apparently when the other kids at school found out about it, they let him have it. And then some.
Hey, Chandler, would you fill me up here?
Oh, I see, because of the third nipple thing.
So yeah, this kid had absolutely nowhere that he could turn where he felt safe or comfortable or valued at all. And not surprisingly, all of these things combined ultimately resulted in a lot of instances of Thienes acting out, or running away, and just getting in a lot of trouble. Evidently, things got so bad at certain times that he toyed with the idea of just ending it all. He wanted to punch his ticket early and piece the fuck up out of here. But for whatever reason, when push came to shove, obviously he decided against it. Instead, he opted to drop out of school entirely before eventually then briefly enlisting in the military. Just like Franz. And actually, this wasn't the only thing that Franz and Thienes supposedly had in common during their younger years. Aside from just objectively being shitbags, Thienes, apparently, like Franz, had also dated a pretty hardcore witch. Now look, I am certainly not fully versed on the witchcraft culture throughout South Africa. According to Google, evidently it's pretty prevalent, so perhaps it's ignorant of me to speculate on the validity of this, but I'm sorry. I call bullshit. When Franz and Thans met, he was 19, I believe, and Franz was like 25, 26-ish. I think that Thans looked up to Franz, that he was desperate for a connection and desperate for a friend, so I think he would have said anything to try to find common ground with him. Because what are the chances that both of these guys' first serious girlfriends were like full-on witches? I think that Franz mentioned that he dated a witch, and then I think Thans was just like,
No way.
you dated a witch? Bro, I dated a witch. And then I think they just like broed out and bonded from there. That's what I think happened. I wasn't there, obviously, so I don't know for sure, but that's what my spidey senses be screaming at me.
Shoot your web.
Oh, no, I'm not Spider-Man.
Shoot it anyway.
In my opinion, no matter what it took, Thans was going to chameleon his ass right into a friendship with Franz by any means necessary. Ultimately, the two did have enough shared experiences and enough common interests to become not just friends, but also partners in crime. Yes, because believe it or not, kidnapping Allison, hijacking her car, and taking her hostage, this was far from Franz and Thans' first experience terrorizing the innocent women of South Africa. And I definitely think that Franz was the driving force behind a lot of the trouble that these two found themselves in. Don't get me wrong, as previously mentioned, Thans was a shithead all on his own. But to my knowledge, he was not out sexually assaulting women or anything like that prior to getting himself all tangled up with Franz. Franz, however, the first sexual assault that he committed, that we know of, that was perpetrated solo. He noticed a girl, a 20-year-old student, sitting in her car outside of a restaurant, and rather than just walking past like a regular person, Franz instead forced his way into her car at gunpoint and then forced her to drive them to a secluded location where Franz went on to brutally rape this girl. And then, as if that wasn't abhorrent enough, this absolute pig then forced this girl to go to dinner with him. This poor girl was so completely terrified of this disgusting, sorry excuse of a man that she sat silently through a full meal with him after he had kidnapped and raped her. And y'all, this is like a thing with Franz. Like, he clearly lacks any regard or respect for women, yet he still has this demented way of trying to act as if he's genuinely a nice guy. And I'm assuming that this is how Franz has garnered himself the title of gentleman rapist. He still wants to portray himself as God's gift to women and a good guy, even though in actuality he's a literal walking fucking nightmare. Like, answer me this, my guy. If you are God's gift to women, as you so claim to be, shouldn't women actually, I don't know, want you? If you were such a gift to women, I feel like you wouldn't have to force them to be with you. Am I wrong? Am I missing something? Because I don't know about you, but for me, that math ain't mathin', bro. Sidebar, once Franz was done with this psychotic little dinner date, he forced this girl to have sex with him yet again, while telling him that she loved him, gross, before he did ultimately finally let her go. However, because he threatened her life if she were to report what happened to her, it took this poor girl almost a full week to get up the courage to actually go to the police. And then, of course, by that time, any actual potential evidence, it was long gone. And sadly, with no evidence to back up what she was saying, regretfully, the police really couldn't view her allegations as anything more than a he said, she said situation. Meaning that Franz completely skirted justice yet again for being just the worst, most miserable sack of garbage one man could possibly be. Mind you, we're not even to the worst of it. Because believe it or not, these two troglodytes actually viciously attacked a completely separate woman before Allison found herself at their mercy. Now, this attack took place on December 4th, 1994, which, if you're paying attention, was in fact just 2 weeks before the pair would then go on to abduct Allison. This victim was a 21-year-old woman who, at the time she fell victim to Franz and Thans, devastatingly happened to be 3 months pregnant. This poor woman was simply trying to walk home when these two fucking goons ambushed her. They accosted her, they held her at gunpoint, and they forced her into a nearby, overgrown thicket type area, where they then went on to take turns brutally assaulting her. And understandably, this woman was terrified of the situation in general, sure, but mainly she was just so scared that being roughed up and forced around like this was somehow going to hurt her baby, which is just like one of the saddest things I've ever heard. When you are pregnant, there is nothing scarier to you than the thought of something happening to that sweet little baby that you are tasked with protecting. And this woman, she begged and she pleaded Franz and Theans to just let her go. But do you think either of them felt even an ounce of mercy for this poor woman? Because of course they did not. They are lunatics. And so sadly, this woman's pleas for compassion for her unborn child, they fell completely on deaf ears. And then, to make matters worse, as if what she'd already been through wasn't traumatizing enough for a lifetime, these two jackasses then stood there in front of this poor woman whom they've already put through absolute hell, and they debated super casually whether or not they should kill her or let her go. Because why not psychologically torment her now too? The fact that they had no qualms in talking about this woman as if her life and her unborn baby's life were just less than insignificant to them. Absolutely vile. Thankfully, Thing 1 and Thing 2 did ultimately decide to let this woman go. As far as I'm aware, she and her baby did physically go on to be fine, although I'm sure she had a lot of mental trauma to deal with, likely for years following this nightmare. Props to her though, because regardless of how terrified she'd been in the presence of Franz and Theans, she certainly was not afraid to try to hold them accountable for what they had done to her, which in and of itself had to be just so scary. But even so, she marched straight into the police station immediately after the attack, and she reported exactly what had happened to her. And surprisingly, both Franz and Theans were arrested and brought into custody on these charges immediately. And that sounds fine and dandy until you realize, like, hey, wait a minute. If they were arrested following this attack, then how is it possible that they were out running amok through Port Elizabeth just 2 weeks later when they abducted Allison? And to that, my friends, I say, judicial failures. That's how. Once they had both been interviewed and given their statements, they were both subsequently released, pending a court appearance almost a month later after the new year. Yeah, what? These men should have never even had the opportunity to be near Allison the night that she was taken. But alas, here we sit. These two men were more or less out on bail, pending sexual assault charges, when they decided to kidnap Allison. And despite the fact that Johnny Law was literally already breathing down their necks, what they would go on to do to Allison would be their worst attack yet. And again, it took place just 2 weeks after their previous attack. But before we get too far into that, I'm going to take my break, throw on my lashes, and when we get back, what Franz and Theans have planned for Allison, it becomes painfully clear. Don't go nowhere. All right, so unfortunately, we're back. Not that I don't want to be back with you, I really don't want to go any further into this story because it's about to get so unbelievably horrific that I hate it. Right before we'd broke for lash time, we rejoined Franz and Theans and Allison in Allison's car, driving aimlessly around Port Elizabeth. Of course, Allison had no idea where they were driving or what they were planning to do with her. All she knew was that they appeared to be gradually driving out of the city and more out into like the suburban area. Still an area that Allison was familiar with. In fact, she kind of hoped that they'd drop her off somewhere within this vicinity. Because for a while, she was in walking distance to both her mother's house and a good friend of hers house. So all she could think about was that if they pulled over and they let her out there, she could run to one of their places, whichever was closest, and she would finally be safe. Unfortunately, though, that simply was not what Franz and Theans had planned for her. Gradually, they drove out of the city. They drove out of the suburbs, and they drove far past her mother's house and her friend's house until eventually they drove so far that there really weren't any buildings or vehicles or even streetlights to be seen. And with each passing minute, feeling as though she was leaving civilization behind her, Allison's fear continued to mount. Ultimately, they ended up driving 14 kilometers straight out of Port Elizabeth and straight into a quiet little beach town called Schoenmakerskap, or in English, it translates to Shoemaker's Hill. They pulled off into a small secluded area. Actually, calling it an area is probably generous. Basically, it was like a small, secluded, sandy dirt road. Franz pulled the car up off the main road. He parked on this dirt road, and almost as if they'd rehearsed it, Theans immediately stepped out of the vehicle and he lit up a cigarette. And for a moment or two, Franz and Allison just sat in the car in like deafening silence. That is, until Allison finally got up the nerve to ask Franz what the plan was for her from there. And y'all, his response, it chilled Allison to the bone. This man, this complete stranger, turned to her and he looked at her and told her, well, I thought you would have realized by now that we're here to have sex. Obviously, when Allison was kidnapped by a man, she knew this was a possibility. But I really don't imagine that your brain lets you believe that that is going to happen to you until you're like truly confronted with it. And while sitting there trying desperately to come to terms with what was apparently about to be done to her, Franz then had the nerve to ask her so calmly, like it was just a regular conversation, "You're not going to fight, are you?" And while I am sure that Allison would have loved nothing more than to go full Bruce Lee on both of these pieces of shit, she knew that realistically, there were two of them and one of her. And that's not even taking into consideration that Allison had never had to fight someone before in her entire life. She didn't even know how to fight. So after taking a few moments there, sitting and weighing her options, Allison simply just resigned herself to the situation, and she told Franz that no, she wasn't going to do anything to try to fight them. And with that, Franz basically immediately then instructed Allison to start taking off her clothes. Of course, Allison did as she was told, but while she was doing so, she couldn't help but notice that she felt like almost out of her body. It almost didn't feel to her in that moment as if she was really undressing herself. It was as if she had somehow managed to completely disconnect her mind from her physical body. And actually, throughout the course of the horrific things that these men would go on to do to her following her undressing, that was the one thing that she tried to constantly remind herself of. She told herself over and over and over again that sure, they may be doing these vile and unspeakable things to her body, but her body was just that. It was just a body. They could do whatever they wanted to her body, but there was absolutely nothing that she believed that they could do to touch or to violate her mind. That was the one thing that she had complete control over, even though she had been completely robbed of control of her physical being. Once Franz had Allison completely naked and completely vulnerable, he then forced her head into his crotch and he demanded that she perform oral sex on him. Again, Allison knew that there really wasn't anything she could do to resist. She was completely at the mercy of these men. So once again, she just did as she was told, constantly repeating in her head, "Please don't throw up." Inevitably, she gagged a few times, which pissed Franz off enough. So she knew that if she threw up, fucking forget it. That surely would have sent him into a blind rage. And once Franz was done with this portion, he then flipped the script and he forced Allison to allow him to perform oral sex on her, which this whole thing is a nightmare, obviously. But that in particular, for some reason to me, just sounds so unbelievably violating that it actually physically turns my stomach. And to make matters worse, mind you, Theans is just watching all of this through the car window from outside, smoking his cigarette like a creep. He stood there the whole time. He watched from start to finish, all the way through Franz actually raping Allison. And one thing that really sticks with me in listening to Allison recount this portion of her attack was when she detailed the fact that she felt so incredibly ashamed and embarrassed and betrayed by her own body when it responded, if you will, to the rape. Like, it responded in a way that you might not necessarily expect a person's body to respond in this particular situation. It responded in a way that you would probably typically only associate with an experience that someone found enjoyable. And listen, I'm not naive, okay? Obviously, that is, for the most part, in a normal and consensual encounter, an enjoyable experience. However, in this situation, that's not at all what it is. Honestly, at first, I hesitated to even talk about this, but then I kind of felt like if I left it out, I would be perpetuating the idea that it was something to be ashamed of. And objectively, that's just not true. Because that happened doesn't mean that Allison was enjoying what was going on, or that somehow that negated the fact that she hadn't given consent. The fact that that happened is nothing more than an uncontrollable physiological response. Think kind of like getting goosebumps. Sure, I've gotten goosebumps before when my husband, who I love, comes up behind me and like rubs my back while I'm doing the dishes or something. Sure, those goosebumps are in response to positive stimuli. However, I've also gotten goosebumps before because I'm cold, which for me is a fucking nightmare. I hate being cold. So same bodily reaction to outside stimuli, but not the same experience, even slightly. Regardless of a person's circumstances, whether they're good or bad, you can't shut off your nervous system, especially in situations where a person is in like a heightened state of awareness. Now, that's not to say that, objectively speaking, I can't understand why Allison would have felt that way in the moment. Because if you've only ever experienced that in a positive setting, to then experience it under circumstances like this, God, I can't imagine how jarring that would be. Thankfully, eventually, Franz was finished, which I'm sure was momentarily relieving for Allison to have that disgusting sack of filth off of her. However, her relief was certainly fleeting, because pretty much as soon as Franz was finished, he immediately then beckoned for Theans and offered Allison up to him, stating, quote, "Do you want to have sex with this lovely lady?" Once again, playing right into this nice guy persona that Franz, for some reason, seems to think that he embodies. And then conversely, playing into the heartless prick persona that Theans clearly embodied, he responded to Franz by stating, quote, "No, I want to fuck the fucking bitch."
Electric chair.
Yeah, just vile. Even Franz acted like he was clutching his pearls at this. He went on to scold Theans and told him that he shouldn't talk like that in front of a lady, as if he has any real, true respect in his DNA for members of the opposite sex. Even Allison, smack dab in the middle of this horrendous ordeal, didn't miss the irony in that. Even she was sitting there like, "Are you stupid?" Which, short answer, yeah, they are. But at any rate, grotesquely, Theans then climbed into the car. He got on top of Allison and he attempted to rape her. However, according to Allison's book, he couldn't keep a boner long enough to actually do it. Instead, I guess he just kind of like violently flopped around on top of her before he then got pissed and slammed out of the car. So while Allison has now at least made it through the sexual component of her attack, it was made very clear to her very quickly that she most certainly was not home free now. If anything, there was apparently now every chance in the world that things were going to get substantially worse for her, because, deja vu alert, immediately after Franz and Theans finished having or attempting to have sex with Allison, right there, right in front of her, just as they had done to their previous victim, they started discussing and pondering and weighing the pros and cons of leaving Allison alive versus murdering her, right there on that dark and desolate road. Now, I think it's important to clarify that as these two pieces of shit were sitting there having this conversation, that is when they actually started carelessly referring to each other by their actual names. Because remember, Franz had been going by Clint up to this point. And actually, I think Theans had been upfront about his name right from the get-go, which, if you think about it, is hilarious, because here Franz is trying to maintain some anonymity, but then he left his friend out to dry by letting him introduce himself to Allison by his actual name. Just Stupid. Nevertheless, though, as Allison was hearing this, horrifying as it was, she still had the wherewithal to not only notice this, but to lock the information into her brain. Obviously, she had no idea if she was making it out of this situation alive or not, but if she did, come hell or high water, this woman is going to make sure that those animals paid for what they did to her and that they never got the chance to hurt another person as long as she had a say. However, sadly though, much to Allison's dismay, by the end of the conversation, given that letting women live after their attacks before had come back around to bite them in the ass, Franz and Theans ultimately landed on the decision that Allison, she had to die there that night. And I can't even begin to try to comprehend just how terrifying that would have had to have been to hear. Of course, she desperately tried to reason with them. She promised them that she wasn't going to go to the police. She told them that they could trust her. She didn't want to tell anyone what happened because she didn't want her parents to find out what she'd gone through. Obviously, this was a lie. Allison had the most supportive parents ever, but right there in that moment, they didn't need to know that. Not that it ended up mattering one way or another, because even after Allison had tried desperately to plead her case, Franz, he didn't believe that she wasn't going to go to the police. And then, before she could even really process what that truly meant for her, Franz, once again, was back on top of her. However, rather than doing so to violate her, this time he placed his hands around her throat and he attempted to squeeze the life out of her. Terrified and completely desperate to survive, Allison tried to squeak out a few last words. She was trying to beg these men to let her live, but Franz's grip on her throat, it was just too tight. Not only had he completely cut off her air supply, but he had actually fully crushed her windpipe. So even if he had let go and he had given her the opportunity to try to speak, she wouldn't have been able to get out a single word. And as Allison's vision began to go black and her consciousness began to waver, the last thing that she remembers feeling was actually her bowels release. Again, a completely normal bodily response to what was being done to her. However, again, poor Allison, she felt embarrassed by this, as if she was in any way, shape, or form to blame for anything about the situation that she was now in. And then, just as she felt that take place, everything went completely black. Once she had passed out, Franz then drug Allison from her car near the road, through some trees, and off the actual path that had been marked out, like in the clearing. And once he felt as though Allison was far enough off of the main road, he then pulled out his knife and he began repeatedly stabbing Allison in the chest as well as in the abdomen. Over and over and over again, he just kept stabbing at her. And he wasn't just stabbing at her, he was making special sure to focus his blows primarily on where he believed Allison's reproductive organs were located. And like, if that right there doesn't illustrate to you everything that you need to know about Franz and how he feels about women, I don't know what else on earth possibly could. During this portion of the attack, Franz stabbed Allison upwards of 40 times, understandably believing that he had successfully murdered her. However, just before he and Theans could walk away from Allison's body, she began to regain consciousness. And as this was happening, completely involuntarily, one of Allison's legs twitched. And of course, one of them saw it. So they turned right back around. Theans then took out his own knife and he began slashing at Allison's throat. And the next part really gives me the freaking heebie-jeebies, because this was all taking place underneath this like gigantic full moon, right? So Allison's attack was basically illuminated for her. She could very clearly see each and every thrust and slash that her attackers made with their knives. Can you imagine anything more terrifying than that? Oh, and the cruel irony of it all, as Franz pushed Theans out of the way and he took over slashing at Allison's throat, the way that the moon was positioned behind him almost made it look like he had a halo.
I don't like that.
Halo and Franz de Trois, those are not two things that will ever go together. Almost 20 times these two savage animals slashed at Allison's throat. They had already partially disemboweled her with their dozens of stabs to her abdomen, and now, as they repeatedly slashed at her throat, they were actually getting dangerously close to decapitating her as well. Yeah, like I said, this case, this story, beyond brutal. However, difficult as it may be to believe, there's actually a silver lining hidden within the fact that Franz and Thiens had decided to cut Allison's throat. Remember how I mentioned that her windpipe had been crushed? Well, had they walked away from her after that first portion of the knife attack, before they started in on her throat, it's actually almost certain that she would have died incredibly quickly upon their departure. You see, with a crushed windpipe, Allison wouldn't have been able to breathe at all following that first portion of the attack. But because she moved and because they then doubled back and they attacked her in the throat, unbeknownst to them, they basically gave her a bootleg tracheostomy. So horrifying and painful and dangerous as it was, the fact that they inadvertently opened up her windpipe like that, actually in the moment, that saved Allison's life. I mean, don't get me wrong, of course, she was still in horrible shape. That should go without saying. But it is just amazing that they managed to cut her enough to open up her windpipe, but that they didn't cut her enough to kill her. One of many miracles that took place that night. However, from where they were standing, they 1,000,000,000% believe that their work there was done. Allison even heard one of them say, as they were finally leaving, that she had to be dead this time because, quote, no one could survive that. Little did they know, though, that Allison had just done that. She had survived everything they had put her through, and she was still alive. Now, granted, she was doing her best to lay as still as a corpse, because she knew that if they came back and they carried out a third round of their knife attack, there was just no way that she could possibly take any more. So, as a means of self-preservation, she just lied there. She lied perfectly still as they got in her car, as they threw her clothes down the hill at her, and as they started her car and drove away. And actually, she still lied there for quite a while after that. Honestly, at the time, I think she had kind of resigned herself to the fact that she was going to die, and I think that she was kind of just trying to lie there peacefully until that moment inevitably came. But as seconds turned to minutes, and the minutes started to add up, she was still there. She was still conscious, still breathing, still alive. And while each moment alive certainly was a gift, understandably, Allison figured that it couldn't possibly last too much longer. I mean, she couldn't even fathom the idea that she was going to make it out of this situation. And as that realization truly hit her, she became overwhelmed with, I wouldn't even say the desire, but the need to do whatever she could to try to make sure that these two heinous excuses for men could never do to another person what they had just done to her. And so, using what she believed to be every final ounce of strength in her battered body, Allison rolled over slightly and she began to write a message in the sand that surrounded her. And that message read, Franz and Thiens. Allison used what she believed to be some of her final moments on this earth to try to protect other women from falling victim to her same fate. And then once she was sure that she had taken care of what she felt was her duty in naming her killers, she then shimmied just a little bit to a new patch of sand where she then wrote out, I love Mom. She wanted her mom to know that in her very last moments alive, that she was thinking of her and how much she meant to her. Literally, that alone could make me cry. That is hands down one of the most loving things I have ever heard. Like, I can't even imagine. Obviously, we know Allison does live through this, but it must have meant so much to Claire when she learned that her daughter had done that. And once Allison had finished writing out what she believed to be her dying declarations, once again, she just laid there, waiting to die. And actually, at one point, she says that she remembers leaving her body. She remembers sort of hovering over herself and staring back down at her body. She says it was the most peace and quiet and serenity that she's ever experienced, being out of that body that had just been through so much. But as she stared down at herself, all she could think was that there was still so much that she had wanted to do in that life that she hadn't gotten the chance to. And so as she floated there, she realized that she had a decision she had to make. Either she was going to allow herself to drift off, to follow the peace and allow herself to die, or she was going to have to return to that body, to return to the pain, and to fight to stay alive. And although letting herself drift away certainly seemed like the easier option, she just knew that she wasn't ready yet. And almost immediately upon coming to that realization, Allison felt as though she slammed back down into her body. And she said that she knew she was back because not only was she no longer staring down at herself, but she also was no longer just experiencing peace and quiet. Rather, now all she could hear was the god-awful, raspy, gasping sound that was coming from her sliced open throat. But even still, somehow, despite all that she had been through, and despite the horrible shape she knew she was in, she still felt as though she had to at least try to fight her way out of this situation and to fight her way to survival. And so, knowing that what she was about to do was going to be the hardest thing she had ever done, slowly but surely, Allison began to roll herself over before then attempting to get up onto her hands and knees. And although she was successful in getting herself rolled over and propping herself up, I think this was when she truly started to realize the actual gravity of her situation. Like, obviously, she knew it was bad, but I don't think it was until she felt something wet and slimy touch her legs that she realized just how truly bad it was. Remember how I said she'd been partially disemboweled after Franz had gone completely insane, stabbing at her abdomen? Yeah, well, the wet and slimy sensation that she was feeling on her legs, that was her dangling intestines. Can you imagine? Because I sure can't. But Allison, she did not let herself be deterred by that for even a second. Instead, she simply shifted into problem-solving mode, and she tried to figure out what she could do to hold her insides in while she attempted to get herself to the road. And thank God that Franz and Tienz had thrown her clothes down on top of her before they drove away, because Allison was actually able to grab one of her shirts and to tie it into like a fanny pack that held her intestines in. I can't even believe that these sentences are coming out of my mouth, let alone that this is a real and true experience that a person lived through. Unfucking real. And yet somehow, this was exactly where Allison found herself, crawling on her hands and knees through dirt and sand, broken glass, trash. There were literal barbecue droppings, like fatty meat bits and charcoal that she was forced to crawl through, all in hopes of trying to survive this brutal attack. However, the longer she tried to crawl and the more cut up that her hands and her knees and her legs began to get, Allison started to realize that if she wanted any hope of making it out of this and getting up to the road, somehow she was going to have to get herself up and onto her feet. She just knew she was never going to actually make it to the road if she kept trying to crawl there one-handed while also trying to support her intestines in her makeshift pouch. So, slowly but surely, through means I'll never understand, Allison did manage to get herself, one by one, back up onto her feet. Thank God, right? Well, yes and no. Sure, she was about to be upright, which was great. However, as she finally managed to stand up from the crouching position she was initially in, suddenly, again, everything went black. And at first, my guess is like, well, maybe she thought she was about to pass out again. Like, maybe she really had been through too much to be trying to physically assert herself like this. But as she continued to stand there and she continued to remain aware, she actually ended up deciding to reach up to try to feel exactly what might be obstructing her vision. And that, my friends, is when she realized exactly why she could no longer see what was in front of her. And that was because she was no longer looking in front of her. Again, please cast your memories back to when I said that Franz and Tienz had damn near decapitated her by slicing at her neck as much as they had. Remember? You remember. Well, although they had managed to miss all of Allison's vital arteries and veins that run through a person's neck, one part of her that they did manage to do significant damage to was the muscles in Allison's neck. You know, the ones that hold a person's literal fucking head on. So yeah, when Allison stood up from crouching, Her barely attached head had quite literally flopped backwards and was now resting in between her shoulder blades. So what did she do? Well, she simply reached up, she grabbed her head by her hair, and she lifted it back into place. Bitch, I get queasy if I cut my leg when I'm shaving. And here is this unstoppable beast of a woman literally putting her own head back into place. Some people are just built differently. I firmly believe that, because I would never be that resilient. And not only did she have to put her head back in place, but she had to hold it there for the entire rest of her journey back up to the main road. And while I'm sure that in the moment, making this journey from where Franz and Tien's had left her all the way back up to the main road, as she was doing it, there is not a doubt in my mind that physically and mentally, it was the hardest thing that she had ever done. However, in retrospect, looking back on this experience, Allison says that she, honest to God, does not remember any of the physical exertion that it took to make it from point A to point B. With the same full moon that had illuminated her attack, now illuminating her path to salvation, Allison claims that once she was upright, she truly feels as though she was lifted up from where she was standing and that she was brought up to the road by some sort of guardian angel. She said that she doesn't remember even a single step, really, from when she put her head back in place to when she then felt herself crash down onto the pavement of the road. Now, was it ideal to be lying smack dab in the middle of a dark road at night? Probably not, but what's the worst that's gonna happen, honestly? Was somebody gonna hit her? Let's not act like she hasn't survived far worse than that already leading up to this. If anything, Allison felt as though maybe her positioning was ideal, because this probably was the best place for her to be in order to be found. Because let's say she collapsed on the side of the road. Well, then there would have been every chance in the world that a passing car might have missed her. However, laying here in the middle of the road, ain't nobody gonna miss her there. So now, really, all she had to do was to wait and to hope and to pray that someone would soon be driving through that area. And actually, lo and behold, pretty quickly after she managed to make it up to the road, a car did begin to approach her. She couldn't believe it. It felt pretty fast, but that was good, right? She was saved. Or was she? Because as that car grew closer and closer, Allison actually started to feel incredibly anxious, because what if it was Franz and Tien's? What if they happened to be driving back through the area? And what if they were the ones that found her? What if they saw that she was still alive and that she'd managed to make it up to the road? I mean, surely they wouldn't be so careless as to leave her alive again. But as terrifying a thought as that was for Allison, there was really nothing that she could do about it now. The car was coming right up on her. So whether it was Franz and Tien's or whether it was someone else, whomever was behind the wheel of that car was about to see her. And as they got closer and closer, Allison could tell that they were slowing down, so whomever it was had definitely seen her. But then, much to Allison's dismay, after cruising up and taking a good hard look at her, the driver of that vehicle simply sped off. Allison, she could not believe it. Just as quickly as she had been filled with hope that she was about to be saved, that same hope had been completely obliterated by this driver leaving her there, dying in the middle of the road. So once again, Allison found herself alone, lying there and desperately hoping that that wasn't the only chance she had at being found. She was praying that her only chance at survival hadn't just driven away with that one singular vehicle. And surprisingly, given just how desolate that road really was, coupled with how late it was, it actually did not take long for Allison to see yet another set of headlights coming around the bend and heading straight for her. And thankfully, this car would stop to help her. And honestly, as much as I hate to say it, these are the instances that truly make me believe that everything really does happen for a reason. Because there's no telling what schmuck was driving the first car that ended up passing Allison, right? However, in this second car, the car that actually stopped, this car was filled with students from over 1,000 kilometers away in Johannesburg. And that night, they just so happened to be passing through Port Elizabeth on vacation. And as if it wasn't enough of a long shot that would have happened at all, even more kismet, I guess you could say, was that among those students was 20-year-old veterinarian student Tien Ellard. Angel. Not to be confused with Tien's Krueger. crap bag.
If you need an easy way to remember it, just think of a bag of crap.
Absolutely anyone could have been in that car. There are thousands and thousands of different possible vocations that the students in that car could have been studying and working towards. And you mean to tell me that a car with a medical student just happens to be the one to pull up? Sure, he wasn't studying to be a human doctor at the time, but he certainly had more medical knowledge and more medical training than someone studying to be a welder would have had. And on top of that, it's 1994, remember? And one of the other students in that car also happened to have a cell phone, something that was absolutely not the norm in that time period. So not only was Tien there to stabilize her and to help keep her alive until emergency services got there, but Tien's friend happened to have a cell phone so that they could actually call emergency services in the first place. Meant to be. You will never convince me otherwise. Tien jumped out of the car and he immediately, without hesitation, sprang into action. He checked Allison's vitals, he assessed the situation, and even with injuries beyond anything that I think anyone could imagine, Tien was seemingly completely unfazed. He ripped off his shirt and he used it to apply pressure to Allison's wounds, while he simultaneously shouted out instructions to his friends, either telling them to call EMS or instructing them on how they could help him tend to Allison. And while there were only a few things that Tien was able to do to help Allison there in the road while they waited for an ambulance, arguably the most important thing that he did for her, other than putting her freaking thyroid back in place, because apparently that had become dislodged, but mostly he just talked to her, promised her that he was going to do everything he could for her, and whatever he could think to say, he did. He knew that the most important thing that he could possibly do in that moment, other than attempt to control Allison's bleeding, was simply to keep her awake. And despite Allison being completely exhausted, understandably, from the horrific ordeal that she had been through up to this point, Allison has gone on to say that Tien being there and being so kind and so supportive actually made her fight harder to stay alive because she didn't want to disappoint this nice man who had stopped to help her. For close to an hour, Tien knelt there in the road with Allison, doing anything and everything in his power that he could to try to keep her condition managed. And as if that wasn't significantly more than most people could or would have done, Tien even went above and beyond when the ambulance did arrive by demanding that he be allowed to accompany Allison to the hospital. He'd seen her through to this point, and there was just no way that he was going to abandon her now and let her go through the rest by herself. Because like I said, he's an angel. You want to know something completely demented, though? According to Tien, paramedics didn't even bother trying to rush Allison to the hospital and they literally said this, there was no reason. Yeah, these emergency medical professionals had taken it upon themselves to resign Allison to death, which is just so reprehensible. I do not care what you think is going to happen to someone in an emergency situation. I don't think that you have the right as a paramedic to decide whether or not to try your hardest at your job. If that's your mentality, you are very much in the wrong field. Thankfully, though, once again, beating the odds, Allison did survive the ambulance ride, despite the drivers doing their best to basically aid and abet her murder. But I digress. She made it, and as soon as she was wheeled in, she was rushed immediately into emergency surgery. To reiterate, Allison had been partially disemboweled. She had been partially decapitated, her windpipe had been crushed, her thyroid had been displaced, she had lost a ton of blood. Her intestines were covered in dirt and sand and charcoal. Her hands and her knees and her legs were sliced to hell and back from crawling through broken glass. I mean, it sounds awful to say, but truthfully, no one had all that high of hopes that Allison was actually going to survive. Much like Franz and Tien's, the doctors also believed that no one could possibly survive what she had been through. However, unlike the paramedics and the driver of the ambulance, the doctors at least didn't let their fears for Allison affect the effort that they put into trying to save her life. And believe me, they had their work cut out for them. Christ, it took them hours just to clean her intestines. And that's before they even attempted to try to Tetris them back into her body. Allison's insides were so dirty from having been exposed to so much that doctors quite literally had to take scrub brushes to some of the sections of them. I'm talking like a literal cleaning brush. And while, yeah, the thought of that sounds heinous, if they had risked so much as 1 grain of sand or dirt being left in Allison's abdominal cavity post-op, there's no doubt that she would have gone septic and she would have died. I mean, thank God she had emptied her bowels before she'd been stabbed, because that alone probably would have killed her. You know, had feces been released into her body when these knife wounds had nicked her intestines. But remarkably, we know that that didn't happen. We know that the neck wounds managed to miss her vital arteries and her vital veins. Somehow her chest wounds had also managed to miss her organs. Yes, had she been through hell and back? Obviously. But that did not change the fact that, from a medical perspective, Allison was truly a miracle. And just like Tian was probably the closest thing to the perfect person to pull over to help Allison in the middle of the road, the surgeon that happened to be on call when Allison was brought into the hospital, well, he was also the absolute perfect person to treat wounds as severe as Allison's. Not only was Dr. Volodya Angelov a certified ENT, so ears, nose, and throat specialist, but because of where he'd gone to school, he had also been required to earn his certification in general surgery. So rather than having to call in an additional surgeon in order to address Allison's abdominal wounds, Dr. Angelov was able to do it all. Now, realistically, I don't think there was anyone on Earth that would have been perfectly equipped to deal with everything that Allison had going on. But I do think it's safe to say that Dr. Angelov was probably about as close as one human could get. Allison was in surgery for over 3 hours to address the wounds to her throat, her abdomen, and her intestines. And while the fact that she had even managed to survive her surgery was a miracle in and of itself, she certainly still wasn't doing well. She was still facing a massive risk of infection. Her throat was so swollen it was almost suffocating her. And beyond that, she was in basically nonstop, excruciating level 10 pain. As a result, Allison was placed in the high care unit of the hospital, and she was monitored constantly. And when she finally woke up after her surgery, she was greeted by her mother, by her father, and also by Tian. Obviously, unbeknownst to Allison, I don't think that he left the hospital at all until he got word that Allison was out of surgery and that she was stable. And even then, I think he just went back to his hotel to shower before he came straight back to the hospital to check on her. And seeing him made Allison so emotional. She felt like she owed this man so much of her survival because of his quick and concise action. And although Tian had to leave to go back home pretty shortly after this, he and Allison would actually go on to become lifelong friends after sharing this experience and going through something so transformative together. Inevitably, they formed an incredibly close and deep bond and connection, but I'll get more into that later. Because also, upon waking up from her surgery, Allison was quickly greeted by the police, who had obviously been contacted by hospital staff following her arrival. And while it was great that police were responding so quickly to a crime that historically up to that point might not have been taken all that seriously, the problem here, though, was that Allison, she couldn't really give him a statement because she couldn't talk. She had a freaking intubation tube down her throat, connecting her to a ventilator, helping deliver oxygen to her lungs. I mean, police tried to work around Allison's condition. They had her manually select photos out of a mugshot book in order to identify her attackers. However, while Allison was able to quickly pick both Fran's and Tian's photos out of this book, on top of writing out a full account of what these monsters had done to her, ultimately, police ended up telling her that her account of her experiences would be more reliable and be more likely to be taken seriously if she gave it to them verbally. And without even giving Allison a chance to respond, doctors were like, absolutely not. This woman just had life-saving surgery on her throat. They were terrified that if they then went ahead and whipped out this intubation tube, they could seriously fuck her just like right back up. If there were complications removing that tube, Allison could have died. Like I said, her throat was so swollen that it was suffocating her after her surgery. But as doctors were trying to explain this to police, that there was no way they were going to take that tube out of Allison's throat, Allison herself began scribbling something down on this like tiny little pad of paper that she had. And when doctors looked at the pad and they read what she had written, they literally could not believe their eyes. Allison had scrawled a very simple, yet very shocking, 3-word demand across her notepad. Take it out, regardless of the risks, regardless of the pain, and regardless of the discomfort or possible complications. If verbal identification was what police needed from Allison to go out and to arrest these losers, then a verbal identification she was going to make. And so, slowly, cautiously, and with terror in their hearts, doctors did ultimately, very carefully, remove the tube from Allison's throat. And just before she gave her verbal identification of her attackers, she first made a point to mention, while smiling, just how nice it felt to have that tube out of her throat. Then, of course, she told police that Franz and Tienz were, without a doubt, the ones who had attacked her. And girl, if Allison was not determined to see these men jailed for the rest of their lives strictly for what they had done to her, best believe she was hell-bent on seeing them rot behind bars once she found out that she was not their first victim. What a gut punch that must have been, to find out that these men had been cut loose following a previous sexual allegation, only for them to then turn around and do what they had done to her 2 weeks later. I would be so pissed. Honestly, I commend Allison for holding her composure and her couth after she found that out. Could never be me. I'm way too temperamental. Now, thankfully, given just how familiar police were with Franz and Tienz and their tomfoolery, they were relatively easily tracked down and brought in following Allison's official spoken identification. And dude, when they told them that they were being questioned about rape and attempted murder, it was like they had been doused in ice water. They were so sure that they had taken care of Allison before leaving her stranded there in the dirt that night, that when police informed them she was still alive, well, according to one of the detectives on the case, you could have knocked them over with a feather. And given that Allison was alive, awake, coherent, and talking, both Franz and Tienz pretty quickly came to the realization that there was really no reason to lie. They both ended up giving full confessions to what they had done, and they were finally carted off to jail where they would remain until their trials. If only police had done that the first time. Now, remarkably, just 13 days after Franz and Tienz had tried to murder Allison, she was discharged from the hospital before moving back in with her mom to recover. Sure, she was lucky to even be alive, and things were going significantly better for her regarding her recovery than anyone could have hoped for. But that is certainly not to say that things were going to be easy for Allison once she got home. Not only would she struggle with depression following her attack, which would be expected, but on top of that, for weeks following her hospital stay, Allison was forced to return to the hospital so that doctors could scrape at her abdominal wound until it bled in order to stimulate new cell growth. As if she hasn't been through enough. Now she has to go and do this on top of the already unrelenting pain that she was in from her initial injuries. And that's not even taking into consideration the mental turmoil that the investigation forced her to go through. Yeah, apparently as part of the investigation, Allison was also forced to report to the police station on multiple occasions so that police could document her injuries as well as how well they were healing. Meaning that Allison would have to drop trow in some random detective's office so that her abdomen and her pelvis could be photographed. Yeah, if you've ever wondered why such a huge percentage of rape survivors don't come forward, this is it, at least part of it. The things that these victims have to go through to hopefully put their assailants behind bars, they're often demeaning and embarrassing and re-traumatizing. It is totally valid that someone who has already been through arguably one of the most dehumanizing and demoralizing things that a person can go through, why wouldn't they want to avoid then having to go through something that feels like more of the same? But as we know, Allison is a fighter. Whatever was asked of her, whatever was required, she did it. No pushback, no argument, no questions. She had come this far, and she had fought through so much that no matter what it took, she was dedicated and she was committed to helping police build as strong of a case as they possibly could against Franz and Tienz. Even if that meant looking directly into their eyes, she was going to do it. Yes, prior to Franz and Tienz being taken to trial, there was one more very scary and potentially very traumatizing thing that Allison was expected to do. And that was to pick Franz and Tienz out of an in-person criminal lineup. And if you've seen any crime drama or movie or what have you ever, then when I say criminal lineup, you're most likely immediately picturing how it's done today. The victim stands anonymously on one side of a one-way mirror, while on the other side, a line of people that hopefully includes the accused, they line up single file on the other side. The victim then, from their vantage point, can see the lineup, while from the other side, the lineup can see nothing other than their own reflections. Of course, then we know that the victim is meant to pick out whom they recognize as the accused, and if they pick right, then this can be used at trial to substantiate the case against them. And thankfully, that is how things went down for Allison. However, what if I told you that Allison's case was the first time in South African history that the criminal lineup process went down like that? What type of scenario would your brain then cook up for how it might have been done before? Because I can guarantee you, whatever you're thinking, what they actually did, way worse. Prior to Allison's case, when attempting to identify their attackers, victims were expected to be in the same room with the folks in the lineup, and in order to identify the accused, victims were to walk up to them and place their hand on their shoulder. Then they had to stand there while police took a photo of them to prove their identification. Truly, the only way I think they could have made that worse was if they offered the victim a copy of the picture on the way out, like a fucking theme park photo. Because seriously, who came up with that process? And follow-up question, what were they thinking? Jesus, I think I'd rather have my wounds scraped out than to have to participate in that style of identity parade. Even Allison herself said that after everything she had been through, that this was hands down one of the worst parts of her whole ordeal. To know that she was in the same building as these men and to have to stare into their eyes, she said it felt as though she had found herself right back there on the night of her attack. The fear and the emotion that being anywhere near these men evoked in Allison, it was unbearable. But if we know anything about Allison by this point in the story, it is that she is strong and resilient, and she is going to do what needs to be done. And that is exactly what she did. Franz and Tien's trial began in June of 1995, so roughly about 6 months, give or take, after their attack on Allison. Oof. And to say that people were shocked and appalled to see Franz and Tien's walking in and out of court free from shackles and free of handcuffs. I mean, after what these guys did, you'd think police would have given them the full Hannibal Lecter. However, allowing Franz and Tien's to walk in and out of court without these protective measures was actually a very strategic move made by one of the main investigators on Allison's case. Detective Melvin Humple, who Allison worked very closely with throughout the course of the investigation, he explicitly made a point not to handcuff these men on their way in and out of court because, in his own words, his dream was that these two degenerate pieces of shit would try something. Try to run, try to fight, try to stir up literally anything. Detective Humple did not care. He just wanted Franz and Tien's to feel safe enough to step out of line because he knew that if they did, he would finally have an excuse to shoot them both. Now, unfortunately, neither of them took this bait, which I have to admit is slightly disappointing, but what are you gonna do? It is a crying shame that Humple didn't just, trip and, unload a clip into each of their heads. What's that TikTok sound? The one that's like, oh, my shoulder, and there's just boom, 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 boom. Sorry, too much? I really hate these guys. Neither of these two ingrates had enough decency in their good-for-nothing bodies to even try to pretend that they felt any guilt or remorse for what they had done. Tien's refused to even take the stand to speak for himself, and Franz recounted everything he'd done with no more emotion than someone who was talking about the weather. And actually, rather than even taking a shred of accountability for the horrible things he did do to Allison, Franz instead tried to explain his actions away by claiming that he'd been possessed by the devil, meaning that he couldn't really be held accountable for anything he did. Ooh, and even more reprehensible than that was that Franz's wife actually showed up to court and she stood by her man's side, if I'm not mistaken, the whole damn time. Yeah, I bet that little tidbit of information is slipped your mind by now. The fact that this motherfucker was married, girl, if I had been that man's wife, you would not have been able to get me to that courthouse at gunpoint to back him, let alone on my own volition. Yet there was his wife every day at the courthouse showing support for her mans. Embarrassing. Obviously, of course, Allison was also present at court for every single day of the trial. And I'm sure that it was not easy for her to sit there and to have the worst experience of her life recounted and dissected and scrutinized just over and over and over again. But difficult as it was, Allison was determined to be there every day because she wanted to look Franz and Tien's in their beady little eyes and remind them that they had lost and that she had won. Ultimately, Franz and Tien's were both found guilty of the crimes of which they were accused, and then subsequently they were both sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. And actually, the judge that presided over the case went so far as to take extra steps in hopes of assuring that neither Franz nor Tien's would ever be released. Following handing down both of their sentences, the judge put a note on each of the men's case files explicitly stating that neither man should ever be considered for release. The note stated that they were simply too dangerous to ever be rehabilitated and that they should never be granted parole of any kind, let alone ever be released back into society. Now, personally, I think that they asses should have been under the prison. However, frustratingly, the death penalty had been abolished in South Africa by the time that the trial rolled around. So this meant that, regretfully, life without parole really was the best that this judge could do. And while, sure, Allison was satisfied with their sentences, I guess, it certainly didn't fix her. It didn't undo everything that had happened. She wasn't just magically better. Following the trial and the gradual reduction in media coverage, sure, justice had been served, but ultimately Allison was left alone to attempt to pick up the pieces of what was left of her life. Like I said, she was incredibly depressed and she struggled a lot with having the worst moments of her life plastered across every newspaper and every magazine that was available to the public. Allison even later explicitly stated that the publicity and the notoriety that had come from her situation, that was all harder for her to actually deal with than it was for her to show up in court each day. And once court was over and the investigation was over and everything was just done, I think that was when Allison realized that her life was never going to go back to how it was prior to the attack. And again, this is something that she struggled with a lot at first. That is, until she realized that if she let what happened to her completely destroy her, then whether Franz and Tien's were in jail or not, they were still winning. They were still holding a part of her. And if she let what happened to her consume her, then what was the point of having fought so hard to stay alive? Why was she going to let them take more from her than they already had? And so, difficult as I'm sure that it was, Allison pulled herself up by her bootstraps and she decided that she was going to take her story and she was going to use it to make a difference. And as Allison began to travel and to share her story, despite the fact that up to this point in South Africa, rape had very much been like a we don't talk about that type of crime, a crime that victims were sort of conditioned to feel immense shame over. Allison's story of determination and of courage, it completely shattered that mold. There was no shame to be felt from Allison. There was no reason for her to be embarrassed or ashamed of what she had gone through. And as she proudly shared her heroic and harrowing story, people were touched by her. They were inspired by her resilience, and they were in awe of her strength. Allison quickly became a symbol to many people of hope and strength and of perseverance. She could have easily let what Franz and Tien's did to her destroy her life, which honestly would have been valid. But instead, she took what had happened to her and she managed to spin it into this amazingly successful empire. She traveled here, there, and everywhere in order to share her story and to encourage and uplift victims all over the world. And undoubtedly, Allison changed so many people's lives by bravely telling her story and by sharing with her audiences the invaluable lessons that her ordeal had taught her. And it wasn't just her professional life that began to flourish once she began her ascent, but her personal life also seemed to blossom as well. well. After meeting a man through a mutual friend at a party one night, he and Allison hit it off. They started dating, and within 2 years, they were married. And miraculously, despite the damage that Franz had done to her abdomen and that he'd attempted to do to her reproductive organs, Allison was actually able to conceive, carry, and deliver not just one, but 2 perfectly healthy baby boys. Something that doctors had been almost certain that she would never be able to do. And because Allison had been so sure that she would never get the opportunity to do so, she truly soaked in each and every moment of both of her pregnancies. She loved being pregnant, and she got pregnant easily, and she had 2 wonderfully easy and wonderfully healthy pregnancies, which honestly is like the least that she deserved after everything she's been through. But are you ready for the cherry on top of the wholesomeness sundae that is the story of Allison's journey to motherhood? Guess who delivered her second baby? Tien motherfucking Ellard, baby. Yep. That's right. Remember when I said that he and Allison built a lifelong bond and connection after what they'd experienced together? Well, as it would turn out, Tien's entire life changed that night after stopping and helping to save Allison. This man experienced a literal medical miracle right in front of his very eyes. And understandably so, afterwards, he was a changed man. He completely diverted from his initial path in life. He gave up his pursuit of veterinary medicine, and instead he decided to go to medical school and to become a medical doctor. Then fast forward, bing, bang, boom, he delivers Allison's second son. Is that not just the coolest and most wholesome, like, full circle moment? Oh, I love that part of the story. Along with being an amazing mother to her 2 boys, Allison also wrote and published a best-selling book titled I Have a Life, which has sold upwards of 100,000 copies and has been translated into numerous different languages. Allison's story was also then turned into an award-winning documentary titled Allison in 2016. Upon the release of the movie, Allison stated in an interview, quote, "I've always hoped that by sharing my own journey with others, it would give them hope and courage of their own. To have my story and ultimate triumph shared on screen would mean that so many more people would get to see the power of choice that we each have. And they then might also choose to triumph over life's hardships." I have both read Allison's book as well as watched the documentary, and I would highly recommend them both. They are both beautifully done and definitely both worth the watch/read. What is appalling, though, about the documentary production process was a big surprise. Franz. Yeah, when he got wind that Allison was in the process of collaborating on a documentary about that night, this motherfucker genuinely heard this. And he thought, I deserve a part of that. No, I am not kidding. Not only did he want to be involved, but this man wrote a letter demanding to be involved, but only under his outlined circumstances. 1, he wanted a written and signed letter of forgiveness from Allison. 2, he wanted a share of the proceeds generated by the documentary. And 3, because yeah, there's more, he wanted a share of all of Allison's profits from not only her book, but also from her motivational speaking career. And he wanted this backdated to the very beginning, because according to him, if it wasn't for what he had done, then Allison wouldn't have a story to sell in the first place. Can you believe the audacity of this subhuman pig? Where does this man get off thinking that he has a right to be involved in anything that Allison produces, let alone that he's entitled to any of her money? Allison does not have success because of you, Franz. She has success in spite of you. So I'm gonna need you to take several seats, my guy. I cannot even believe that he sat there and wrote that letter and read it and was like, yeah, that seems reasonable. Be so fucking for real. Now, I'm sure I don't have to clarify this, but just to make sure I cover all my bases, Allison declined this offer, and she went on to produce the documentary without Franz's undoubtedly useless input. And guess what? It was still wildly successful without him. Go figure. Sadly, though, Allison's life has not been all sunshine and rainbows following her ordeal or the conclusion of the trial. She and her husband did end up separating, which ultimately did lead to divorce, something that I'm sure was incredibly difficult. I mean, I can't imagine a scenario where that'd be easy. However, post-divorce, Allison and her ex did remain close friends, and they always remained dedicated to co-parenting their children together. So while the dissolution of their marriage was, I'm sure, not what they had dreamed of, I'd still say that it seems to to have panned out the best that it possibly could as far as divorce is concerned. Sadly, though, less acceptable for Allison was a change in South African law that I believe took place in 2004 that deemed life sentences without parole to be inhumane. And horrifyingly, yes, that did extend to Frans and Tien's as well, meaning that at some point, these two ingrates would now actually be eligible for release on parole. A thought that, as I'm sure you can imagine, was quite upsetting for Allison. Not a single day went by that she did not think about or fear the possibility that Frans and Tien's could someday walk free among society again. But unfortunately, beyond protesting at their parole hearings, whenever they came up, there really wasn't anything that Allison could do besides push through and hope that it never happened. And, you know, for almost 30 years, her desperate pleas against their release had panned out in her favor. That is until 2023, when both Frans and Tien's, this time completely unbeknownst to Allison, once again came up for parole. And without her there to share her story and to advocate for herself and for their continued incarceration, Frans and Tien's were granted parole and subsequently released just 28 years into their life sentences. And Allison, she wasn't made aware of this until the decision had already been made. Now, I did read that the decision is currently under review, so I suppose it's possible that their parole could be rescinded and that they could be re-imprisoned, depending on how said review goes. But for now, they're out. They're free and they're just walking around out there among society. And sadly, I fear that the longer they're out without incident, the less realistic it is that the justice system would decide to maneuver all the red tape it would take to actually get them back behind bars. And that's despite a Change.org petition that is currently sitting at 16,000 signatures opposing their parole. And poor Allison, this is quite literally her worst nightmare come to life. These men are only in their, 40s, 50s? So in my opinion, they've nowhere near aged out of crime. Not to mention that they were essentially out on bail the night that they attacked Allison. So is parole really going to keep them from committing more crimes? I guess only time will tell, but I certainly don't feel confident about that. I don't know about you. But what I do know is that their release has had some really detrimental effects on Allison. On September 25th, 2024, so just slightly over a year after Frans and Tien's were released, Allison suffered a massive brain aneurysm, and she had to undergo life-saving brain surgery in order to stop her bleeding and to relieve fluid buildup on her brain. Thankfully, Allison did survive this second near-death experience because she's a warrior. However, she is certainly far from through this battle and on the other side. When asked to comment on Allison's condition, her mother Claire stated in an interview, quote, "I am beside myself that my child, who was afflicted by a second death blow, has exceeded all expectations and has lived. I can touch her and hold her hand, and she is still in this life with me. What would I do without her?" Like, this woman has been through enough for multiple lifetimes, yet here she is still just fighting and kicking ass and taking names. The aneurysm affected movement in Allison's extremities, it affected her ability to walk, and it also affected her vision. However, she does seem to be improving bit by bit, day by day. Now, personally, I believe that she will come through this. She will come out on the other side, and she will be stronger even than she was before. I think she's going to handle this just like she did her first brush with death. But you cannot tell me that it is not incredibly coincidental that a year after these two were released, she had this health episode. I know stress can't cause a brain aneurysm, but the increased adrenaline and blood pressure of stress, that can contribute to the rupture of one. So personally, I think that Frans and Tien's are just as much to blame for this incident as they were for the first one. And with that, you guys, we are about wrapped for today. Sadly, Allison is currently unable to work given the state of her health and the extensive treatments and round-the-clock therapies that she's in need of, meaning that she is very quickly racking up some incredibly overwhelming medical debts. There is a trust that's been set up for Allison in order for people to make donations towards helping her manage her rapidly increasing bills. So if by chance you're able to, I have left the donation instructions down below in the description. I know things are tight for damn near everyone anymore, but if you have a few extra dollars and you'd like to contribute to the cause, I know for a fact that it is going to someone who is very, very deserving. But yeah, let me know your thoughts on this case in the comments down below. As always, I thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video and to listen to this story. And of course, one big final thank you goes out to Angie and Anika for requesting it. If you have a case or a topic you'd like to see me cover, please fill out the case submission form that I have linked down in the description. And if by chance you're interested in anything about today's makeup, I will also make sure to have the links and the information for the products I use today listed down there for you as well. If you haven't already and you'd like to, go ahead and subscribe to my channel. I put out new videos every 10 days. The date of my next video should be on the screen here for you. But if you turn on your post notifications, you'll always be notified when I do post, and you'll always be sure to catch me back here in my next one. Until then though, stay safe and have a good week. Bye guys. That they were going to, wow, real world consequences during his parents instead whisked him away from Franz and Franz to deal with everything and because in his own words, his dream, well, Tien's refused to even take the span. She would never get the opportunity. He wanted to